You're listening to the Valley Current.
Picture the date for a second. It is April 20, 2026.
Right.
And right now, as you are listening to this deep dive, the entire global economy is, well, it's quite literally hanging by a thread.
Yeah, it really is.
Because 50 days ago, a hot war between the United States and Iran broke out. And this isn't just, a localized conflict. It has completely fractured global markets, paralyzed supply chains, and frankly, rewritten the landscape of modern geopolitics.
It's a total paradigm shift.
Exactly. So to understand how we arrived at this absolute brink, we're diving deep into this incredible stack of notes you've brought us. Specifically, this is an exhaustively detailed international law and geopolitical risk bulletin.
Yeah, it's from the Computer Law Group, LLP.
Right, authored by their managing partner, Jack Russo.
And it's just a fascinating document because what Russo and his team have done here is they've managed to strip away the daily noise of the news cycle.
And there is a lot of noise right now.
So much noise. But they look past it to examine the actual structural machinery of this crisis. They are rigorously analyzing the intersection of international law, energy markets, and negotiation theory, right in the middle of an active war zone.
Which is just wild to think about.
Yeah.
And our mission today is to take that analysis and ask one central, overriding question.
Right.
Can a negotiation style built for, say, Manhattan real estate actually close a sovereign deal with a nation at war?
Yeah. Does the art of the deal work when the stakes are literally nuclear?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, before we jump into this timeline, I do want to make a quick note to you, the listener. We are dealing with highly charged political figures today, right? Donald Trump, the Iranian leadership, active military operations.
It's a very sensitive topic.
It is. So our purpose here is strictly analytical. I want to be clear about that. We aren't taking sides, and we definitely aren't endorsing any specific political viewpoints here.
No, not at all.
We are simply unpacking the mechanics of geopolitical negotiation tactics, seeing how they collide with international law, and just helping you understand the massive forces shaping this crisis.
I think that's crucial. If you really want to understand why this crisis is just oscillating so violently from day to day, you have to separate the personalities from the structural dynamics.
Right.
We need to look at the underlying theories of coercion and deterrence.
So let's unpack this. Because reading through the timeline of the last 45 days in this analysis, I gotta say, it feels less like reading history and more like watching someone try to juggle live grenades.
That is exactly what it feels like.
We need to trace the exact sequence of events here.
Yeah.
Let's start with the ignition point on February 28th. How did we actually get here?
Okay, so at 1:15 a.m. Eastern Time on February 28th, the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury.
Wow.
And that strike killed Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, along with several really senior officials from their Supreme National Security Council.
Just a massive decapitation strike.
Exactly. And just to give you a baseline of where the world was at that moment, right before this happened, West Texas Intermediate Crude Oil WTI was sitting at a relatively stable $67 a barrel.
Which feels like a lifetime ago now.
Doesn't it? Yeah. Because almost immediately after the strike, Iran retaliated by deploying its most potent asymmetric weapon.
Right.
They completely closed the Strait of Hormuz.
Which is just the ultimate global choke point.
Yeah.
I mean, we're going to break down the terrifying math on that oil shock later. But the immediate result is just absolute panic.
Panic everywhere.
And then about a week later, on March 8, we see this massive internal political shift in Tehran. The Assembly of Experts confirms Mujtaba Khamenei, who was the 56-year-old son of the late leader, as the third supreme leader.
Yes.
But the analysis points out something truly bizarre about this transition.
Yeah, it's super weird.
He hasn't actually been seen.
That's right. He hasn't appeared publicly at all. Official statements are literally being read by state TV anchors.
Which is so strange for a new leader.
It is. And that unseen status means that the real day-to-day authority inside Iran has become incredibly diffused.
Meaning spread out.
Exactly. It's spread out among the parliament speaker, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, the various commanders of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, and President Masoud Pezeshkian.
So why does that matter so much for a negotiation?
Well, because diffusion of power is a massive structural hurdle when you're trying to forge any kind of peace treaty.
Oh, I see.
You have a brand new supreme leader whose entire legitimacy rests on not looking weak, right? Especially in the immediate aftermath of his father's assassination.
Well, he can't look like he's backing down.
Exactly. So if power is fractured, no single individual has the political capital to just make a major concession. If they do, the hardliners will immediately accuse them of treason.
Wow. And right into the middle of that Iranian power vacuum, on March 6th, Donald Trump fires off a social media post.
Yep.
And he states there will be, quote, no deal with Iran except its unconditional surrender.
Which is quite a statement.
Yeah. And the analysis identifies this as the first formal maximum pressure anchor. What does that mean?
So in negotiation theory, this is known as textbook extreme anchoring.
Okay.
The concept is that you set an opening demand so astronomically high, like, I don't know, total unconditional surrender, that any subsequent movement toward a compromise makes it feel like you are offering this massive concession.
Oh, right. So you force the other side to meet you halfway, but halfway still heavily in your favor.
Exactly. It's a classic boardroom tactic.
Yeah.
But as we're going to see, applying corporate tactics to a sovereign state that is literally fighting for its survival, it yields vastly different results.
Because it immediately sets off this really erratic chain of ultimatums.
Yeah.
It does. By March 21 and 22, we see the first 48-hour Hormuz ultimatum. Trump publicly threatens to obliterate Iranian power plants, starting with the biggest one first.
Right.
But then, like 12 hours before the deadline actually hits, it's extended.
Which is wild.
And Iran's foreign ministry just flat out denies that any negotiations are even happening. We end up seeing 3 separate extended deadlines over the next few weeks.
Which introduces a really fascinating point of friction here. You have these highly public threats of catastrophic military action, and they are explicitly tied to hard deadlines. But the deadlines keep moving.
Right, they keep punting it.
Exactly. And every time a deadline shifts without a resolution or some kind of consequence, the credibility of the underlying threat just begins to fray.
It weakens it.
It completely degrades the psychological leverage.
But despite the public posturing, the back channels actually start to quietly activate around March 25.
Yes, they do.
Pakistan steps in. Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif and Field Marshal Asim Munir, they deliver a U.S. 15-point plan to Tehran.
Which is a huge development.
It is. And Iran's reaction is to instantly dismiss it as extremely maximalist.
Yeah.
But I really want to highlight Pakistan's role here because the analysis links this back to the 1969 Nixon-China backchannel.
Pakistan's involvement is arguably the single most critical architectural element, keeping this entire situation from just going over the cliff.
Really? The single most critical.
Yeah, I mean, finding a mediator with deep operational, military, and intelligence ties to both Washington and Tehran is exceptionally rare.
I guess that's true.
Pakistan is effectively trying to build this secret bridge across a chasm that is, publicly widening by the hour.
And it is widening fast. Yeah. We get to April 5, which was Easter Sunday, and the document refers to this as Power Plant and Bridge Day.
Yeah, that was a dark day.
Trump sets an 8 p.m. Tuesday deadline and issues a genuinely chilling warning. He states that, quote, a whole civilization will die tonight, never to be brought back again.
I mean, that is the absolute zenith of rhetorical escalation. The psychological design there is to force immediate capitulation through just the sheer paralyzing terror of absolute civilizational annihilation.
And amazingly, it seemingly produces a result.
Well, sort of.
Or at least a mirage of one, right? Yeah. On April 7, a ceasefire is announced just hours before that Tuesday deadline, brokered again by Pakistan.
Right.
And the global markets react with pure relief. WTI crude oil, which had spiked all the way to like $117 a barrel, plummets back down to around $95.
A massive drop.
Global stocks surge, and this 2-week clock begins.
But you have to look closely at the foundation of that ceasefire.
Okay, what do you mean?
Well, it wasn't built on any actual resolution of the underlying geopolitical issues.
Right.
It was merely a temporary pause, and it was bought and paid for under the explicit threat of total destruction.
Wow.
In financial terms, that kind of ceasefire is basically a derivative instrument, not a foundational asset.
Oh, that's an interesting way to put it.
Yeah, its value is entirely dependent on the volatility of the actors involved.
Let's unpack that derivative instrument idea, because the foundation cracks almost immediately.
It does.
On April 11 and 12, we have the first direct high-level Islamabad talks. Vice President J.D. Vance, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner meet face-to-face with Iran's parliament speaker Ghalibaf and Abbas Araki.
Right.
And this is the highest level direct contact between the U.S. and Iran since 1979.
It's historic.
And it totally collapses.
Yep.
They hit a wall on three specific things: the timeline for nuclear enrichment, the removal of highly enriched uranium, and operations in Lebanon.
They just hit bedrock. I mean, you simply cannot paper over a 15-year gap in nuclear enrichment timelines with a temporary ceasefire.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The fundamental existential differences between these two states immediately tore right through that fragile pause.
Which brings us to the whiplash of April 13th.
Oh, man.
Trump announces a U.S. naval blockade of Iranian ports, saying it will end as soon as an agreement is signed. But wait, by implementing the blockade, doesn't that legally nuke the April 7th ceasefire?
Yes. Absolutely. A naval blockade is universally recognized as an act of war under international law. By formally announcing it, the U.S. essentially negated the pause in hostilities. I mean, you cannot have a ceasefire and a naval blockade simultaneously. It just doesn't work.
Yet somehow the paradox deepens. Amidst this newly declared U.S. blockade, on April 17th, Iran suddenly announces that the Strait of Hormuz is fully open.
Right.
The market reaction is violent. Oil drops 12% in a single day. The war's largest single-session plunge.
Yeah, people were thrilled.
Trump posts that progress is moving quickly. And for about 24 hours, the world exhales.
But again, it's a paradox that cannot hold.
Right.
You have an American blockade and an Iranian open strait existing in the exact same physical space. It defies all strategic logic.
And reality catches up on April 18 and 19. The strait abruptly closes again.
Yep.
Iranian gunboats open fire on Indian-flagged, very large crude carriers. They hit the Sanmar Herald, which is carrying like 2 million barrels of Iraqi crude, and a bulk carrier called the Jag Arnav.
Which is a huge escalation.
India immediately summons Tehran's ambassador. Trump responds by posting, "No more Mr. Nice Guy," and threatens every single power plant and bridge again, while simultaneously announcing that Witkoff and Kushner are heading back to Islamabad.
Just total chaos.
And that chaotic sequence brings us right up to today.
So if you synthesize that timeline, what you're looking at is not just a random sequence of chaotic events.
Okay.
You are witnessing a real-time stress test of a very specific methodology. It is testing the absolute limits of using highly public, deeply volatile ultimatums as a primary diplomatic tool against a sovereign state.
It's staggering. I mean, trying to negotiate under these conditions, it feels like asking two people to defuse a bomb together, but one person keeps randomly turning the lights off and screaming that the building is rigged to blow.
That's a perfect way to visualize it.
Like the ground is shifting, the rules keep changing, and the communication is happening via unhinged public broadcasts.
Right. The established instruction manual, international law, career diplomacy, structured dialogue, it's all just being set on fire. The erratic nature of this timeline is not an accident. It is a deliberate, documented strategy.
Right. And to understand why that strategy is failing so spectacularly here, we have to dig into the underlying psychology of the art of the deal.
Exactly.
The analysis asks a very blunt question. Will these real estate tactics work with Iran? And the definitive answer seems to be no.
A hard no.
So let's break down the 6 observable tactics that form this strategy. And more importantly, let's explore why they structurally fail in this environment.
Okay, so the entire approach is built on an engine of 6 specific tactics. We've touched on the first one already, extreme anchoring.
Right. Opening with a maximalist demand to skew the entire spectrum of compromise.
Exactly. Now, the second tactic is walkaway credibility.
What's that?
This is the absolute necessity of convincing your opponent that you are genuinely willing to leave the table and just blow up the deal. If they don't believe no deal is a real outcome, you have zero leverage.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, the third tactic is transactional bilateralism. This means treating the negotiation like a one-on-one commercial real estate contract, right?
Yes.
You intentionally cut out multilateral treaties, you sideline the United Nations, you completely ignore European allies. It's just you versus the guy across the table.
Yep, keep it isolated.
Fourth is prioritizing personal envoys over career diplomacy. Instead of using the State Department's institutional knowledge, you rely entirely on personal proxies, like Jared Kushner or Steve Witkoff.
Right. So the authority rests entirely on personal chemistry and proximity to the leader rather than institutional weight.
Wow. Okay, fifth is the aggressive use of public ultimatums. You bypass private diplomatic channels and use public platforms, specifically social media, to generate massive external pressure.
Yeah, you're forcing the counterparty to react in front of a global audience.
And the sixth tactic is cultivated unpredictability. The goal here is to keep your adversary completely in the dark regarding your actual threshold.
Right, because if they cannot identify your red lines, they cannot optimize their own strategy against them.
Now, to be fair, the analysis points out that these aren't just arbitrary, chaotic moves. They reference Thomas Schelling's famous 1960 book, The Strategy of Conflict.
Oh, yeah.
Schelling is a giant in game theory, and he actually validates these six tactics as highly effective coercive tools, right?
Absolutely. Schelling's work is basically the bedrock of Cold War nuclear deterrence. Coercion, brinkmanship, unpredictability, these are valid, historically proven ways to force an opponent's hand.
Okay, so they do work?
Yes, but where the analysis gets brilliant is how it contrasts Schelling's theories of coercion with a 1995 theory by James Fearon.
Okay.
Fearon introduced the concept of the commitment problem in sovereign negotiations. And this is exactly where the Manhattan real estate methodology hits an indestructible brick wall.
Okay, let's unpack the commitment problem, make that tangible for us. How does it break the real estate model?
Think about the fundamental difference between a real estate market and the global geopolitical stage.
Okay.
In real estate, if you sign a contract and the other party breaches it, what happens?
They take them to court.
Right. You take them to court. There is an overarching legal authority, a judge, a sheriff, a state that enforces the commitment.
Right.
The global stage, however, is what political scientists call an anarchic system. There is no global police force capable of forcing a superpower to honor its word.
Right. If the U.S. breaks a deal, Iran can't exactly call 911 or sue them in small claims court.
Exactly. So the commitment problem dictates that an authoritarian regime rationally cannot and will not disarm if they expect the other side might back out of the deal after that disarmament becomes irreversible.
Wow.
Because if Iran dismantles its nuclear centrifuges, it takes years to rebuild them.
Right.
But if the U.S. lifts sanctions, it can snap them back into place in 24 hours.
The risk is completely asymmetrical.
Exactly. Therefore, the very tactics that make the art of the deal work in business, specifically boasting about your walkaway credibility and aggressively avoiding binding multilateral treaties, they actively destroy the exact type of trust required for a nation to surrender its ultimate security guarantee.
Okay, let me stop you there and just push back on this a little bit.
Sure.
Hasn't unpredictability worked recently?
Right.
Look at the USMCA, the trade deal between the U.S., Mexico, and Canada.
Right.
Trump used these exact tactics. Extreme anchoring, threatening to walk away from NAFTA entirely, cultivated unpredictability. He kept them guessing, wore them down, and arguably extracted major protectionist gains for the U.S.
Yeah.
Why can't that work here?
It's a great question, and it's a comparison a lot of people make, but it ignores the fundamental nature of the stakes.
Oh, so?
The USMCA was a trade agreement negotiated between allied democracies. The United States, Mexico, and Canada shared deeply integrated economies, overlapping institutions, and a foundational baseline of mutual survival. Nobody was threatening to bomb Toronto if dairy quotas weren't met. You were negotiating over tariffs on auto parts.
Right. The worst case scenario is an economic recession, not a crater in your capital city.
Precisely. A nuclear standoff with a hostile adversary involves existential stakes. If a Democratic leader miscalculates a trade deal, they might lose the next election.
Yeah.
But if an authoritarian leader miscalculates a nuclear disarmament deal, their regime falls and they often lose their life. The margin for error is exactly zero.
Which brings up a phenomenal quote in the source material from Karim Sajadpour at the Carnegie Endowment. Back in April 2025, he predicted this exact gridlock.
Yeah, I love this quote.
He said, quote, "These negotiations are not going to be about the art of the deal. They're going to be about the science of verification. If getting a nuclear bomb is a 26-mile marathon, Iran is in mile 25.
The science of verification. That phrase is the absolute antithesis of a handshake deal brokered by a personal envoy over dinner.
Yeah, it really is.
When a hostile state is at mile 25 of a nuclear marathon, you cannot verify they've stopped running with a social media post or a verbal promise. You need intrusive, undeniable scientific machinery.
Like what?
You need 247 camera feeds, snap inspections, international atomic energy experts on the ground. Real estate tactics inherently bypass this kind of institutional verification, which is why they fail against the commitment problem.
And you can see the sheer destruction of trust if we look at recent history. The analysis points directly to the 2018 U.S. withdrawal from the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA.
Right.
Trump used that withdrawal to perfectly demonstrate his walkaway credibility. He proved he would tear up a deal. But what did that actually teach Iran?
Well, it taught them that American commitments are only as durable as the current administration.
Oh.
The analysis cites Richard Nephew, who documented that the 2018 withdrawal had a massive accelerating effect on Iran's nuclear program.
Really? It accelerated it.
Yeah, big time. Before the withdrawal, Iran's nuclear breakout time, which is the time needed to produce enough fissile material for one weapon, was roughly 12 months, and their enrichment was capped at 3.67%.
All right, so a year out.
Right. But after the U.S. walked away, Iran pushed that breakout time down to mere weeks and spiked their enrichment up to 60%.
Oh my.
The tactic backfired strategically.
So because these tactics actually exacerbate the commitment problem, the two sides have arrived at the negotiating table in Islamabad, living in practically alternate universes.
Completely different realities.
Let's look at the actual demands being passed back and forth. The analysis outlines Iran's 10-point plan against the U.S. 15-point plan, and the structural distance between them is just staggering.
It is the ultimate manifestation of extreme anchoring from both sides. They are anchored so far apart that the documents are fundamentally irreconcilable as they are currently written.
Okay, let's translate these plans for you listening at home. What is Iran actually asking for in their 10-point plan?
Let's hear it.
First, they want a permanent halt to all U.S. and Israeli military aggression.
Okay.
Second, full relief of all primary and secondary sanctions across the board, U.S., EU, UN, everything. They want all IAEA resolutions targeting them terminated.
Wow.
Crucially, they want a formalized U.S. non-aggression treaty that actually includes an enforcement mechanism. They want war reparations. And point 7 is the real deal breaker. They demand that uranium enrichment continues under domestic Iranian control, capped at 5%, monitored by the IAEA.
Now, if you look closely at that list, notice what it accomplishes.
What's that?
It completely preserves the Iranian regime. It preserves their regional network of proxy forces. And by insisting on domestic enrichment, even if it's capped at 5%, it preserves their status as a threshold nuclear state.
Oh, you see.
They get to keep their entire deterrence architecture intact while gaining massive economic relief.
Now let's look at Washington's alternate reality, the U.S. 15-point plan. The U.S. is demanding a 20-year total moratorium on enrichment. They demand that all highly enriched uranium, or HEU, be physically shipped out of Iran.
Huge demand.
They want the total dismantlement of the Natanz, Fordow, and Isfahan enrichment facilities.
Yeah.
Strict, permanent limits on ballistic missiles, an immediate end to all financial and military support for Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and Iraqi militias.
Right.
Formal recognition of Israel's right to exist. And in exchange for all of this, the U.S. offers phased sanctions relief. 30% upon signing, 40% after 6 months, and the final 30% at 18 months.
The U.S. plan is designed to systematically dismantle Iran's entire grand strategy.
Yeah, it takes away everything.
Let's just look at the facilities you mentioned. Natanz is their primary enrichment site. Fordow is a facility literally buried deep inside a mountain, specifically built to be immune to most American and Israeli bunker-busting airstrikes.
Right.
Highly enriched uranium is the prerequisite for a weapon. The U.S. is basically saying, tear down your immune facilities, give us the material, abandon your regional allies, and maybe over the next year and a half, we'll lift the sanctions.
It's easy to see why the Islamabad talks imploded. I mean, the analysis identifies 3 core sticking points where everything just ground to a halt.
Yeah.
The enrichment timeline, right? 20 years versus 5 years.
Yes.
The physical location of the HEU and the scope of operations in Lebanon. But beyond just the text of these demands, there is a massive internal political constraint on the Iranian side. Speaker Ghalibaf is leading these talks, but he has a gun to his head back home.
Literally and politically. We mentioned earlier that the new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, is unseen.
Right.
Because of that power vacuum, Ghalibaf is under immense scrutiny from the IRGC and the hardliner establishment.
He can't look weak.
Exactly. He entered these negotiations with a hardliner reputation. He simply cannot return to Tehran and present a deal that looks like total submission to the very country that just assassinated their previous supreme leader.
And hanging over every single mood Ghalibaf makes is a very specific, deeply traumatic historical precedent. The analysis calls it the ghost of Libya.
Yes.
We need to really expand on this because this explains the Iranian paranoia perfectly. What happened in Libya?
Well, in December of 2003, Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi succumbed to immense pressure from the United States and the United Kingdom. He agreed to fully and transparently dismantle Libya's weapons of mass destruction programs. He allowed international inspectors in. He surrendered 24.7 metric tons of mustard gas, and he completely dismantled his nascent nuclear program.
So he actually did it.
He did exactly what the West is currently demanding of Iran.
He gave up his leverage. He stepped out from behind the bulletproof glass. And what was his reward?
Fast forward to 2011. During the Arab Spring uprisings, a NATO-backed coalition intervened in Libya, ostensibly for humanitarian reasons.
Right.
Gaddafi's regime was overthrown, and Gaddafi himself was dragged through the streets and brutally killed by rebel forces.
There is a devastating quote in the analysis from Gaddafi's son, Saif al-Islam. He said, quote, "Over one night, they changed their mind and they start bombing."
And that sequence of events to disarmament, followed inevitably by Western-backed regime change, is the single most potent weapon the hardliners in Tehran possess.
I can see why.
Whenever someone like Ghalibaf suggests compromising on the nuclear program, the hardliners just invoke the ghost of Libya. They argue with historical evidence that American demands for disarmament are not about peace. They are merely phase one of a regime change operation.
Wow.
And the analysis makes a brilliant point. When Trump publicly refuses to provide non-aggression guarantees before disarmament is complete, he actively validates that exact fear.
Think about that from the Iranian perspective. We're demanding they throw away their only umbrella in the middle of a Category 5 hurricane, promising we'll build them a secure roof in 18 months.
Right.
Why would they ever trust that? Especially when they watched us demolish the roof of the guy next door in Libya. And on top of that, Trump fires off a public post screaming, "No more Mr. Nice Guy." How does that affect Ghalibaf? If he compromises an inch after a public threat like that, he looks like he's bending the knee. He looks weak to his own military.
Which makes compromise practically suicidal for him. In negotiation theory, extreme anchoring and the threat of walking away only work if you possess a genuinely credible bait TNA.
Jargon check. What is a BTNA?
Best alternative to a negotiated agreement. It's your backup plan. It's what happens if you walk away from the table.
Okay, so what is Iran's BTNA?
Iran's BTNA is brutal, but survivable for the regime. They retreat their nuclear program deep underground into places like Fordo, they absorb the economic pain, and they unleash their proxies to endlessly harass global shipping.
And what's the US BTNA?
The US BTNA is escalating to a massive regional war and attempting the total destruction of Iranian infrastructure. But the U.S. alternative is heavily constrained by massive ticking clocks that are destroying Washington's leverage.
Let's talk about those ticking clocks, starting with the loudest, most terrifying one, the energy clock.
Yeah, this is huge.
The numbers the analysis provides here are just staggering, and we need to trace exactly how this hits you, the listener at home. What does the closure of the Strait of Hormuz actually mean for the world?
Well, the Strait of Hormuz is the absolute jugular vein of the global economy. The analysis notes that roughly 20 million barrels of oil per day transit through that narrow waterway.
20 million, wow.
That represents about 20% of all global petroleum liquids, and more importantly, 25 to 27% of all seaborne oil.
Okay.
Plus, approximately 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas, LNG, goes through there, including 93% of Qatar's exports.
Well, wait, let me stop you there for a second. The U.S. produces a massive amount of its own oil now, right?
We do, yeah.
We aren't as dependent on Middle Eastern oil as we were in the 1970s. So why is Washington panicking?
Because of Asian dependency.
Ah.
The U.S. only takes about 2.5% of Hormuz crude. But look at our most critical geopolitical allies. Vortexa data in the analysis shows China relies on Hormuz for 37.7% of its crude. India relies on it for nearly 15%.
Wow.
And Japan. Japan is facing roughly 75% crude import dependence on Hormuz and 70% LNG dependence.
So the U.S. might not freeze in the dark immediately, but our strongest allies in the Pacific are facing a total economic collapse.
Exactly. Zero Carbon Analytics projects that Japan's April crude imports are down 70% year over year due to the blockade.
70%.
You cannot run an advanced industrialized economy on a 70% energy deficit. And the financial cost to move whatever oil is escaping the Gulf is skyrocketing.
Because shipping rates are insane. The analysis notes that very large crude carriers, the VLCCs, on the route to China hit an all-time high of $601,569 per day during the peak closure.
Unbelievable.
Over $600,000 a day just to rent the boat. And the maritime war risk insurance, it jumped from 0.125% of the ship's hull value up to 5%. If the ship has any ties to the US, UK, or Israel, insurers are demanding up to 10%. That is an extra $2 to $15 million per trip, just in insurance premiums.
And we really cannot overlook the human catastrophe here either. The UN Secretary General has called the situation unprecedented in the modern era.
Yeah.
There are approximately 20,000 seafarers stranded on over 2,000 vessels stacked up west of Hormuz. They are sitting ducks. At least 10 seafarers have already been killed in ship attacks since this began.
I want to make sure you listening to this understand the domino effect here. These aren't just abstract numbers. Let's trace that single barrel of oil.
Let's do it.
Because 20 million barrels are blocked, those VLCC rates spike to $600,000 a day. That cost gets passed directly to the refineries. The refineries pass it to the distributors, which means the price of diesel fuel in the United States skyrockets. Every single thing you buy, groceries, clothes, medicine, is delivered on a diesel truck. So a stranded ship in the Middle East directly doubles the cost of your grocery delivery in the Midwest. It fuels massive global inflation.
And the buffer to prevent that inflation is gone.
Right.
The U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve, the SPR, is sitting at approximately 413 million barrels, which is its lowest level since the mid-1980s. A coordinated release with the International Energy Agency is already partially exhausted.
Wow.
The macroeconomic alarms are blaring. The IMF warned in their April 14 outlook that a severe, prolonged closure pushes global growth down near the 2% threshold.
And 2% global growth isn't just a slowdown. That is the technical threshold for a global recession, comparable to the 2008 financial crisis.
That's exact.
Your retirement accounts, your job security, your mortgage rates, all of it is tied to that strait. That is the leverage Iran holds.
Which means the U.S. does not have infinite time to play hardball. The art of the deal tactic of threatening to walk away requires the psychological condition of abundance.
Right. You need options.
You have to believe you have more time, more money, and more alternatives than your opponent. But with Asian economies screaming for relief and inflation threatening a 2008-style crash, the energy clock is rapidly compressing U.S. leverage.
And Iran knows this.
Oh, they definitely know. Ghalibaf went on television and explicitly boasted that Iran stands firmer than the day before the ceasefire.
But the energy clock isn't the only thing ticking. There is a massive legal clock running out in Washington right now. How does domestic U.S. law constrain the president here?
It comes down to the War Powers Resolution of 1973.
Okay.
This law requires the president to notify Congress within 48 hours of introducing U.S. forces into active hostilities. The administration officially filed that report on March 2.
And then what?
The moment that report was filed, a 60-day authorization clock started ticking. That clock expires right around May 1st.
Wait, what happens on May 1st? Does the military just have to pack up and go home?
Legally, under the statute, the president is required to withdraw forces unless Congress has either declared war or enacted a specific statutory authorization for use of military force, an AUMF.
Do they have an AUMF?
No. There is a 30-day buffer period for withdrawal, but the core reality is that Congress has not authorized this war. The old 2002 Iraq AUMF was repealed, and the 2001 post-9/11 AUMF cannot legally be stretched to cover a sovereign conflict with Iran in 2026.
In fact, the Senate actively voted against a War Powers Resolution on April 15th. So Congress is implicitly saying no. Now, I imagine the White House could just ignore the deadline. The courts rarely intervene in foreign policy, right?
That's correct. The analysis notes that under precedents like the 2000 Campbell v. Clinton case, the courts will likely dismiss any congressional lawsuit based on a lack of standing.
Right.
A judge isn't going to order the Navy to stand down. But the political and diplomatic costs of waging a massive unauthorized war past the 60-day mark are immense.
It looks terrible.
It destroys American credibility at the negotiating table. If the U.S. president cannot even get his own Congress to authorize the war, how can he guarantee Iran that Congress will authorize the permanent lifting of sanctions in a peace deal?
The commitment problem strikes again. And then we have international law, which the analysis argues is also severely undermining the U.S. posture.
Yeah, it's a mess.
Let's start with Iran closing the strait.
Yeah.
They can't just legally claim the ocean. Right.
No, Iran's closure is blatantly unlawful. Under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS, Article 44 establishes the right of transit passage.
Okay.
This is a fundamental principle of global trade. You cannot suspend the passage of ships through an international strait, ever. Now, neither the U.S. nor Iran has formally ratified UNCLOS, but the International Court of Justice established long ago that transit passage is customary international law binding on everyone.
Right.
Iran is also violating the San Remo Manual by failing to notify shipping of sea mines.
So Iran is operating outside the law. But Iran's counterargument is that the U.S. naval blockade announced on April 13th is an act of aggression, which they claim voids their obligations. Is the U.S. blockade legal?
It is highly contested.
Really?
Under UN General Assembly Resolution 3314, a blockade is defined as an act of aggression unless it meets one of two criteria. It is either a legitimate act of self-defense under Article 51, or it is explicitly authorized by a UN Security Council resolution.
And neither applies here.
Right. Russia actively vetoed a resolution that would have provided cover on April 7.
And the analysis points out a specific flaw in how Trump announced it.
Yes, the San Remo Manual dictates that for a blockade to be legal, it must be declared, effective, and crucially, impartial.
Impartial.
It has to apply to everyone equally.
Yeah.
But Trump explicitly stated the blockade applies to Iran only. By targeting a single nation's vessels, it loses its impartiality, making it legally precarious.
Ah.
And since Iranian tankers are reportedly slipping through the lines anyway, it fails the effective test as well.
Then there are the threats to infrastructure. Trump repeatedly posting that he will destroy every single power plant and every single bridge.
Right.
This isn't just tough talk. It has severe legal implications.
Massive implications. Additional Protocol I to the Geneva Conventions strictly prohibits blanket attacks on civilian infrastructure.
You can't just blow up a bridge.
No. You cannot legally target a power plant just to cause societal pain. It must serve a distinct military objective. Furthermore, the Rome Statute elevates intentional attacks on civilian objects to a war crime.
Wow.
Over 100 international law scholars signed a letter warning that executing this threat would constitute grave breaches of international humanitarian law.
So to summarize the U.S. posture, the blockade's legality is crumbling, the war powers clock is screaming toward midnight without congressional backing, and the commander-in-chief is publicly threatening actions that scholars classify as war crimes.
It's not great.
The analysis notes that in corporate law, creating a cloud of legal uncertainty is a great tactic. It forces the other guy to settle just to stop paying lawyers. But in sovereign diplomacy,
it is entirely counterproductive. It feeds directly into Iran's narrative.
how so?
It gives Tehran a massive platform to claim they are the victims of illegal American aggression. And that's a narrative that resonates deeply with the Global South and the 135 countries that co-sponsored a recent UN resolution on the matter.
Oh, wow.
It makes businesses freeze up completely because they don't know which laws apply. Legal chaos prevents treaties, it doesn't forge them.
Okay, so if the real estate playbook of extreme ultimatums, legal chaos, and public threats is actively failing against these ticking clocks, what actually does work?
That's the good question.
The CLG analysis doesn't just point out the flaws, it provides a historical blueprint. Jack Russo's team looked at 7 historical precedents to find the actual structural architecture of a successful sovereign deal.
This is where the document shifts from diagnosing the pathology of the crisis to actually prescribing the cure. Let's look at the successes first.
Okay.
The 1981 Algiers Accords successfully freed American hostages in Iran. It worked because it utilized a neutral mediator, Algeria, and established an international claims tribunal rather than relying on a handshake.
Right.
The 2015 JCPOA nuclear deal worked because it was built over 2 years of absolutely secret backchannel talks in Oman, and it was anchored by multilateral European allies, not just the U.S.
And granddaddy of them all, the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis.
Oh, yeah?
Kennedy and Khrushchev postured fiercely in public, but the actual resolution trading Soviet missiles in Cuba for U.S. missiles in Turkey was negotiated in total secrecy between Robert Kennedy and Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin.
Exactly. Now, contrast those with the glaring failures.
Okay.
The 2019 Hanoi summit between Trump and North Korea's Kim Jong-un, it was pure art of the deal. Highly publicized, bilateral, personality-driven, with almost zero working-level pre-negotiation.
And what happened?
It collapsed spectacularly. And today, North Korea has an estimated 50 nuclear warheads. And of course, Libya in 2003, where bilateral disarmament led to regime decapitation.
But the analysis zeroed in on one very specific historical parallel that reveals exactly what it will take for Iran to concede today. The 1988 Iran-Iraq ceasefire.
Yes.
Walk us through why Iran finally surrendered in that conflict.
In 1988, after 8 years of horrific trench warfare, Iran finally accepted UN Security Council Resolution 598. It wasn't because economic sanctions had magically broken their spirit. No, it was because the realities on the battlefield became undeniable. The commander of the IRGC, Mohsen Reza, wrote a highly classified letter to Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khomeini. In it, he bluntly admitted that military victory was impossible within 5 years without massive influxes of advanced weaponry they just couldn't acquire.
And there was a horrific catalyst right at the end, too. On July 3, 1988, the USS Vincennes, an American-guided missile cruiser, mistakenly shot down Iran Air Flight 655, a civilian passenger jet, killing 290 people.
And that tragedy acted as a tipping point. The Iranian leadership interpreted the shootdown not as a mistake, but as a deliberate signal that the United States was formally entering the war on Iraq's behalf.
Wow.
Facing the prospect of fighting the full might of the U.S. military, combined with the IRGC's admission of operational failure, Khomeini made his famous address where he stated that accepting the ceasefire was more deadly than drinking from a poisoned chalice.
Drinking from a poisoned chalice. That is the level of psychological burden we are talking about.
And it is.
The lesson here is profound. Iran only concedes at a grand strategic level when its own military command internally acknowledges defeat. Economic pain is not enough. And as we mentioned earlier, Ghalibaf's April 18 victory speech heavily implies that the IRGC does not feel militarily defeated right now.
Precisely. So drawing from all of these historical precedents, the analysis synthesizes 7 vital conditions that absolutely must be present for a durable deal to emerge here.
Let's lay out those 7 conditions. 1. Iran must perceive that continued military resistance is an existential threat to the regime itself, not just an economic burden.
Right.
2. There must be a confidential neutral mediator backchannel to bypass public posturing. 3. Face-saving architecture. Both sides need a political trophy they can hold up to their domestic audiences to prove they didn't surrender.
Crucial.
4. Intrusive, multilateral scientific verification that can survive the changing winds of democratic elections in the West. 5. Real front-loaded sanctions relief that Iran can feel immediately. 6. Multilateral anchoring, bringing in Europe or Asia to guarantee the deal. And 7. Explicit security assurances that address the fear of the Libya scenario.
And if you measure the current U.S. strategy against those 7 conditions, it falls dramatically short. The public, bilateral, real estate approach satisfies almost none of them.
None of them.
However, there is one massive ray of hope in the analysis. The one condition that is currently being met is the existence of a confidential mediator. And that brings us to the critical role of Pakistan.
The analysis calls Pakistan the golden bridge in this crisis. Why is Islamabad so uniquely positioned to stop World War III?
Because Pakistan possesses a convergence of relationships that no other nation has right now.
How so?
On the American side, they have deep historic defense and financial ties. They purchase American F-16s, they collaborate on counterterrorism, and they rely heavily on U.S. support for IMF bailouts. They speak the language of Washington.
Right.
On the Iranian side, they share a massive volatile border. They share deep energy corridor aspirations, and they have complex demographic ties, sharing a large Shia Muslim population.
And it isn't just about geography. It's about the specific human beings in the room.
Yeah.
You have Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif handling the diplomatic sais, but the real power is Field Marshal Asim Munir, the Chief of Army Staff.
Yes.
He is a former director of the ISI, Pakistan's premier military intelligence agency.
That military intelligence background is everything here. Field Marshal Munir has operational, pragmatic relationships with both the Pentagon and the IRGC.
He talks to both militaries.
Exactly. Career diplomats talk in theory. Military intelligence chiefs talk in hard realities. The analysis draws a direct, brilliant parallel to 1969, when Pakistani military intelligence provided the absolute secrecy necessary for Henry Kissinger to open communications with Zhou Enlai in China. Pakistan knows how to run a shadow channel.
And the analysis points out that while those high-level talks in Islamabad on April 11th and 12th broke down, they didn't collapse entirely.
No, they made some progress.
Right. The U.S. and Iran actually found agreement on lower-tier issues. They framed out a prisoner exchange, established humanitarian corridors, and even created a technical working group for Hormuz deconfliction. They only hit the wall on the 3 radioactive issues: the enrichment timeline, the location of the highly enriched uranium, and Lebanon.
Which means the structure of a deal is already partially built. Pakistan's ability to act as a buffer on those three radioactive issues is the most plausible path to survival.
How would that work?
By using parallel indirect communications, where the US and Iran sit in different rooms and Munir shuttles between them, it allows both sides to explore compromises in total secrecy, without risking a public leak that would trigger the hardliners in Tehran or Washington.
What stands out to you listening to this, to me, it's this concept of building a face-saving architecture.
Yeah, that's huge.
In a commercial real estate deal, it's a zero-sum game. You want to crush the other guy and take his money. You want to be the unambiguous winner. But in sovereign diplomacy, with nuclear survival on the line, both sides need to walk away with a trophy.
Absolutely.
Ghalibaf needs to show the IRGC that he stood tall against the great Satan and kept their nuclear threshold intact. Trump needs to show his base that he bullied Iran into submission and secured Israel. Pakistan is the only actor in this entire drama actively trying to forge those mutual contradictory trophies in the dark.
But the tragedy of this moment is that the public cycle of ultimatums is constantly threatening to burn that bridge down. Every time a social media post threatens to obliterate a civilization, it destroys the domestic political space Ghalibaf needs to accept Pakistan's quiet compromises.
Which leads us to the grim conclusion of Jack Russo's analysis. We need to distill all this geopolitical theory into the stark reality facing businesses and citizens today.
Yeah, the rubber really meets the road here.
The analysis provides a probability matrix and a severe warning for the corporate world. They define the current ceasefire as a derivative instrument. What does that mean for a company trying to operate right now?
It means that if you are a logistics company routing ships, an energy firm buying futures, or an insurance syndicate underwriting maritime risk, you cannot treat the current absence of missiles flying as a stable, bankable condition.
It's not a guarantee.
Not at all. The baseline reality is highly volatile. As we witnessed with the April 13 blockade announcement, a week's worth of painstaking diplomatic progress can be instantly unwound by a single 3 a.m. social media post.
And the legal foundations for business are crumbling in real time. The analysis highlights that the Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, had a specific general license U that expired precisely on April 19th at 12:01 a.m.
That expiration creates an immediate, terrifying compliance nightmare for multinational corporations.
Oh, I bet.
If you deal in dual-use technologies, or if your supply chains touch Middle Eastern energy routing, the legal ice you're skating on just cracked. Because of the expiring war powers clock, the legally contested blockade, and the utter lack of congressional authorization, American commitments are structurally less reliable today than at any point since the war on terror began.
So if we can't trust the daily headlines or the politicians' statements, how do we know if a genuine, durable peace deal is actually coming? The analysis gives us a vital clue. Look at the concept of multilateral anchoring. Don't watch Washington and don't watch Tehran. Watch Tokyo, Seoul, and New Delhi.
This is perhaps the most practical takeaway from the entire document. Those major Asian economies are the true proxy for whether the U.S. strategy is holding.
Because of the oil.
Because of the oil. They're the ones absorbing the catastrophic economic pain of the oil price shock. Their willingness to publicly tolerate a 70% drop in their energy imports is the only true measure of whether Trump's walkaway threat is credible.
Right. If Japan and India finally crack under the inflation and start publicly demanding that Washington end the standoff immediately, U.S. leverage vaporizes overnight. They are the hidden architects of this crisis.
And that reality informs the final probability forecast from the CLG team. Looking at the erratic 45-day pattern and weighing it against the historical requirements for a deal, they assign only a modest probability to a simple ceasefire extension of 2 to 4 weeks.
Just a modest probability.
Yes. They assign a significantly lower probability to any substantive, lasting framework agreement being signed by the end of April.
And the terrifying number is the last one. They assign a chilling 30 to 40% probability of resumed, full-scale U.S. military strikes.
The Treasury Department is actively preparing new financial kill switches. The Pentagon's strike packages are loaded in loitering. And the war powers clock is imposing a hard, immovable domestic legal deadline around May 1, completely independent of whatever Kushner and Ghalibaf are discussing in Islamabad.
It's all coming to a head.
The analysis concludes with a summation that should really be etched in stone. The science of verification is not optional. The art of the deal is not enough.
Think about the absolute fragility of that reality for a second. The cost of your groceries, the safety of 20,000 stranded seafarers, the stability of the global financial system. None of it is anchored to a solid treaty or a binding legal framework right now.
It's terrifying.
It is all oscillating wildly, swinging on a pendulum based entirely on the midnight mood and the timing of a social media timeline.
It is a profoundly unstable way to manage the survival of the global economy. What we are witnessing is the catastrophic limit of applying bilateral, personality-driven, zero-sum tactics to a multilateral, existentially weighted sovereign conflict.
Let's recap the incredible journey we've taken through this document today. We've seen exactly how the aggressive, unpredictable tactics that conquer Manhattan real estate fundamentally crash into the commitment problem when dealing with an authoritarian state fighting for survival.
Right.
We've explored how the ghost of Libya haunts Tehran's every move, demanding the rigorous science of verification over a handshake. We've traced how the ticking energy and legal clocks are systematically eroding U.S. leverage, placing unbearable strain on our Asian allies.
The pressure is just immense.
And we've seen how a quiet, historically proven backchannel running through military intelligence in Pakistan might literally be the only thread preventing a global economic shock that makes 2008 look like a mild correction.
The structural forces at play, international law, energy dependency, and the history of nuclear coercion, they are vast. The mechanisms currently being used to manage them have never been more mismatched to the task.
I want to leave you, listening at home, with a final lingering thought to mull over long after this audio stops. We have spent this entire deep dive talking about personal envoys, about the reliance on human chemistry, personal relationships, and the sheer willpower of individual deal makers.
Yeah.
But if a single impulsive public post can undo weeks of painstaking life-saving diplomacy, if a burst of personality can shatter the fragile trust required for nuclear disarmament, it forces us to ask a terrifying question. In the highly complex, interconnected 21st century, does human personality actually get in the way of global peace? Are we entering an era where our very survival must depend entirely on cold, institutional, invisible machinery, on the rigid science of verification, rather than the erratic art of any single human deal maker? Thank you so much for bringing these incredible vital sources to the table today. Keep digging, keep questioning the underlying mechanics of what you see in the news, and we will see you on this deep dive.
Tune in next time on The Valley Current.